we've sent 50% of our handheld anti-tank weapons and possibly some natures of ammunition from our existing stocks, meager as they were, to Ukraine. And that needs to be replenished really quickly. Because the one lesson that comes out of Ukraine, above all else, is that to fight a modern conventional war in Europe, you need tons of stuff, if I can use the technical term, and we just don't have tons of stuff. The rates of ammunition expenditure, artillery ammunition, are way beyond what peacetime estimates were. And that's something that we've got to take cognizance of.
Defence is front and centre today, and stick with Times Radio this morning because we're going to hear from the Defence Secretary at 7 o'clock and then at 7:30, former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. We've got all the analysis for you here. It's because the Prime Minister's promised to increase spending to what will be 2.5% of GDP. That's by 2030. Currently, it's about 2.3%. And the Prime Minister says he's putting our defence industry on a war footing. I wonder how that makes you feel. Well, speaking alongside the NATO Secretary General during a visit to Poland yesterday, Sunak said NATO members can't expect the US to pay any price for defending the West, particularly if we ourselves are unwilling to make greater sacrifices for our own security. He's challenged other NATO countries to match our commitment.
I believe we must do more to defend our country, our interests, and our values. So today I'm announcing the biggest strengthening of our national defence for a generation. We will increase defence spending to a new baseline of 2.5% of GDP by 2030. That starts today and rises steadily in each and every year. Over the next 6 years, we'll invest an additional £75 billion in our defence, and it will be fully funded with no increase in borrowing or debt.
Well, former Defence Secretaries have welcomed the news, including Ben Wallace, who we'll hear from at 7:30, and Sir Michael Fallon.
Well, I welcome it too, and some of us have been calling for it for a while. It's very welcome, but of course it is essential. The threats to our country have increased quite markedly in the last few years. The threat from Russia, obviously, on our own continent, Iranian missiles flying around the Middle East, attacks on British shipping, instability in the Pacific. This is a much more dangerous world than it was even 10 years ago. And therefore, we have to be better prepared to defend ourselves against it.
And will this help us do that? Listening to that is Colonel Stuart Crawford, defence analyst, former army officer, who's with us now. Stuart, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
So when the Prime Minister says we're now on sort of a war footing, what do you interpret that to mean?
Well, I mean, previously it's been said that we're in a pre-war situation rather than a post-war situation, and I think that's probably a pretty accurate description of where we stand. As many people have already commented, the threats and risks are considerably heightened now compared to what they were over the past 20 years. And we have to acknowledge the fact that our defence forces have atrophied. The Cold War dividend, you might call it, but the forces have atrophied or been hollowed out. And we've got a lot of ground to make up. The increase to 2.5% is welcome and a step in the right direction. But many people, including me, would like to see it go further than that, up to 3%. And we have to remember that countries like Poland, which are on the front line, if you like, the brave new world on the Russian frontier, are approaching 4%. That's Poland and some of the Baltic states. So it's a step in the right direction, but there's an awful lot that we have to do, and quite quickly.
You know, it's interesting when you talk about increasing spending even more. The perception we get as the public is we are, or anyone in that world says inevitably, look, we need more money. And analysis in The Economist yesterday was saying, look, something's rotten in Britain defence, because even though we're the 6th largest military spender in the world and the largest in Europe, it's not necessarily clear where the money goes if we're spending it effectively and efficiently.
Well, I think the answer to that is that we're not, and haven't been for some considerable time. I mean, you know, we could single out all sorts of projects showing where money is being spent profitably with little return. The classic example being the Ajax armoured cavalry vehicle project, which is delayed by about 10 years, a £5.6 billion budget, of which over £4 billion has already been spent, and not one vehicle has entered service yet.
Mhm.
And that's because of what I and others call British exceptionalism. We seem to be unable to do anything simply buy equipment off the shelf and use it without all sorts of gold plating and manipulation and so on and so forth. So that's the sort of thing that we've got to get right. And but people have been talking about that for decades. I mean, I worked in defence procurement in the 1980s, and we were complaining about it then, and nothing much has changed.
Equipment is one problem. Personnel really is another. You know, when the Conservative Party entered government, the British Army had over 100,000 people in it. Now, it's due to fall to about 72,000. I mean, there is a problem with recruitment and then retaining the people who are in the forces.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Our recruitment has fallen because I think for a variety of reasons. One of them is that an army career, and I'm speaking about the army rather than the Navy and the Royal Air Force, is not seen as something that's exciting because it's not seen as a sort of blossoming organization. In fact, it's seen as a failing organization. This is compounded by the fact that recruitment has been outsourced. I won't mention the company's name, but I think everybody knows who it is. And that has seemingly led to enormous delays between application and actual entry into the army, sometimes a year or more. And to be perfectly honest, young people are not prepared to wait that long to get into uniform, and I don't blame them. So I think that there's a very strong case to be made for terminating the outsourced contract for recruiting and bringing it back in-house. And that, there's no substitute, in my opinion, for Colour Sergeant MacDonald down the Army recruiting office, being the first filter in the recruitment process and telling you whether you should proceed or go home and try something else.
Do you think there's enough sort of public appetite and a desire really to serve your country in that way?
Well, I'm very conscious that I think it was 1938, the Oxford Union debated that this House would not fight for its country, and the debate was carried handsomely. And yet, 2 years later, everyone was either in uniform or sadly dead
Yes,
or
of
captured.
course, yeah.
So I think the same would apply. It's fine to talk about it in the abstract, but if things were dropping, on London, Birmingham, and Glasgow, I think a lot of people would come round to the view that they needed to do something about it.
Yeah. We've depleted somewhat quite a lot of our actual arms to Ukraine, £500 million announced for Ukraine this week. Clearly, we're making the decision that is where the money needs to be spent right now.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in interest of national security, exact figures are difficult to come by or impossible to come by
Yeah.
to someone like me. But I would suggest that in some cases we've sent 50% of our handheld anti-tank weapons and possibly some natures of ammunition from our existing stocks, meager as they were, to Ukraine. And that needs to be replenished really quickly. Because the one lesson that comes out of Ukraine, above all else, is that to fight a modern conventional war in Europe, you need tons of stuff, if I can use the technical term, and we just don't have tons of stuff. The rates of ammunition expenditure, artillery ammunition, are way beyond what peacetime estimates were. And that's something that we've got to take cognizance of.
Who does have tons of stuff?
Well, I mean, the Russians. The Russians have got tons of stuff because of the scale of their military, the fact that they don't seem to throw anything away or scrap it like we do. They put it into storage, and hence they've been able to replenish their considerable losses in Ukraine in tanks and armored fighting vehicles by bringing the older stuff out of storage. Now, an old tank is not the equivalent of a modern NATO tank, but in the final analysis, a tank is a tank is a tank, and if you've got lots and lots and lots of them, a quantity has a quality all of its own, as they say.
It raises the question then, of course, of the strength of NATO. And, Donald Trump's made very clear that he thinks all contributing members should reach that threshold. The Prime Minister sort of said almost as much yesterday. Is actually better defence spending is as a unit, if everyone contributed more, that made us safer rather than, us individually on our own?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think anyone in the British government envisaged that that the country would go to war, for example, with Russia on our own, without allies, without our NATO allies, and that's very much the bedrock of our defence policies, and long may it continue so. And NATO, in all its glory, considerably overmatches Russia. So I think that that's the strength of our defence posture. But we've got to be seen to pay our way. And I think that Donald Trump was quite right in his last period in the White House to threaten, although I don't think he'd ever actually have done it, but to threaten to withdraw US support for NATO unless Europe began to pay its way.
Yeah.
And, the German Chancellor has been lecturing our Prime Minister about upping our defence spending. But Germany is, in terms of GDP, spends less than the UK. So, we've got to be realistic about this. But certainly, we've got to look at the threat and the new risks and match that with our increased spending insofar as we can against other demands.
Thank you so much for your analysis. It's been brilliant to just sort of tease through some of the detail. Stuart Crawford, leading defence analyst and former army officer, going through, well, really everything the Prime Minister's announced.